I say, what would happen if the boat sank from its weight and you're in the boat and you have this tremendously powerful battery and the battery's now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there? By the way, a lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? A lot of shark.
Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. If a time traveler from 20th century American government landed in today's political landscape, she would be stunned by the sheer depth of the debasement. Every conversation, every policy, every fact has become the subject of fierce dispute, driven by a Republican Party that is reflexively contrary, puerile, and entirely under the sway of an apparent madman. With the full backing of the Republican House, Donald Trump waged war on the very notion of his conviction on 34 counts of falsifying records. The entire Republican leadership now is promoting the delusion that a conviction by a New York State jury on New York State charges brought by a local New York City prosecutor is somehow the work of President Biden. Trump has used this manufactured outrage to swell his campaign coffers, raking in $53 million in the 24 hours after the verdict. At his first major rally since the conviction, Trump compared the relative dangers of sharks and electric boat batteries. Later that week, he returned for the first time since the insurrection to Capitol Hill, where Republican lawmakers climbed over each other to kiss his ring. Meanwhile, President Biden presented a stark and complete contrast to Trump, with poignant fortitude and a steadfast commitment to the rule of law, accepting a verdict in a case brought by a holdover Republican prosecutor targeting his only living son. Biden, of course, could have derailed the prosecution at multiple junctures, but chose not to, showing a statesmanlike judgment that would have been inconceivable for Donald Trump. The Republican House ended its week of silliness and savagery by voting to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt for not providing an audio tape of a special counsel interview with President Biden. It's no secret the Republicans want to use the tape to make selective and distorted cuts for misleading political TV commercials. Not that the nasty gesture has any chance of success, since the materials the Republicans are seeking are covered by executive privilege. To chronicle a week in which Republicans and their standard bearer descended even deeper into relentless assaults on their political opponents and the institutions of government, we welcome three of the country's best political thinkers and analysts, all returning guests to Talking Feds. And they are Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes the weekly column on life in Washington. She previously served as editor of several Washington publications, and Susan's written several books, including The Divider with Peter Baker, which we covered in a Talking Books episode. Hi, Susan.
Hey, great to be with you.
Rick Wilson, the Rick Wilson, a political consultant turned political writer and co-founder of the all-important Lincoln Project. Rick previously was a highly sought-after political strategist and counselor. Since leaving politics, he's published 2 books, Everything Trump Touches Dies and Running Against the Devil. Welcome, Rick Wilson.
Thank you, Harry.
And Jacob Weisberg, the executive chair and co-founder of Pushkin Industries. He was previously CEO of the Slate Group, co-founder of Panoply, and editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine. Jacob's the author of several books, and he serves as vice chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Welcome back, Jacob.
Glad to be here.
Trump took to Capitol Hill this week on what you can only call a post-conviction victory tour, where he was met with, I think, what you can only call rapturous applause. He reminisced fondly about January 6th. It's hard to think of a more vivid example of the world turned upside down. How should Democrats or the media or just normal, sane people be reacting to this?
Well, look, Harry, I think this is one of those displays that Trump demands of his followers in elected office periodically, where even the ones who are not what I call Trump hotties, who are not comfortable with Trump in some meaningful ways, they're still going to show up, kiss the ring. They always strike me as like hostages. I keep waiting for one of them to blink out the word torture in Morse code. But he has to exercise this because his dominance over the party is always, in his mind, fragile. He's always looking for disloyalty. He's always hunting for someone who's against him because Trump needs enemies within more than he needs enemies without, in a weird way, to contain that. It's like yesterday, you saw Mitch McConnell, who, as we all know, heartily despises Donald Trump. And yet, there he was, kissing the ring. He doesn't want the disruption of Trump's anger and rage about his candidates when he's trying to retake a majority.
Susan, as far as McConnell goes, you tweeted out the image of Trump and McConnell kind of gingerly holding hands with the caption, "Portrait of Surrender." So look, McConnell, the same elder statesman, or so we thought, who as much as judged him guilty for January 6th, even though he didn't vote to convict. Is there not a single Trump holdout now in the Republican Party? Is the purge complete?
Yeah, that photograph, somebody said to me, it reminded them of Lee at Appomattox. This was an unhappy man doing an unhappy thing. You could see that there, but you could also see that in some ways it was the complete and logical end stage Mitch McConnellism, which you can argue that all Republicans who aren't fully MAGA subscribers are suffering that same condition of, late stage McConnellism, which is to say they've convinced themselves that the only future of their party lies with this man and, the forces that he has sort of activated and pulled together. They're not necessarily new forces in the Republican Party, but this is the world's most successful hostile takeover. Donald Trump was an outsider to the Republican Party. He wasn't even a member of the Republican Party. I think he switched parties something like 5 different times earlier in his life. And yet he has essentially taken it over so completely that even people who despise him have to now abase themselves in order to imagine a path forward. I think this year's primaries, such as they were in the Republican Party, suggested there are not 100% of MAGA voters, but maybe there's 75% of MAGA voters. And of the remaining, many of them, like Nikki Haley, are willing to criticize Donald Trump and then crawl on their bellies as well. So what's the distinction between MAGA and not MAGA, except the level of humiliation that, one is willing to go through after seeing that Nikki Haley literally said in February, this winter, that Donald Trump was unhinged and unfit for office. 2 months later, she said she was going to vote for him without even bothering to pretend that he had become more hinged in the subsequent 2 months. And actually, just a quick point on Trump's visit to Capitol Hill yesterday, his very first since his effort to overturn the 2020 election. The accounts that came out of the closed door meeting with the House Republicans in particular in the morning were so remarkable because even for a fervent believer in the full cult of Donald Trump, it strikes me that it was probably pretty hard to take. This is a meeting in which Donald Trump rambled on. Even Fox News chief congressional correspondent said there were so many tangents. He quoted a Republican congressman saying, "I couldn't take it anymore" after 45 minutes. Trump went from Taylor Swift to why Milwaukee is a, quote, horrible city. Milwaukee, where they are literally going to be nominating Trump for president again in a few weeks. I mean, he went on about how he and Nancy Pelosi should have dated in another life, except that she's too old for him. And I mean, the cult requires incredible amounts of contortions from the cultists in order to maintain itself.
Harry, let me add a couple things there. The first is my mentor in journalism, Michael Kinsley, used to always say, insincere flattery is more flattering than sincere flattery. And this is what's going on here, right? It's a capitulation to your power. It's recognizing that Trump owns the store and, what they think privately doesn't matter. They have to kiss the ring. But I'm concerned that we are maybe misinterpreting a lot of this sort of what you might call the daily garbage from Trump. We see him attacking Milwaukee, the city where they're having the convention and swing state, criticizing Taylor Swift. I mean, these things look to us stupid, obviously bad moves, dumb, ridiculous, not even getting into dating Nancy Pelosi and his fear of sharks, whatever. But what this also does is it is daily entertainment. And an advantage Trump has, or something he uses to his great advantage, is that voters know that he will be providing that entertainment. And if you're someone who has a different kind of relationship to politics, one in which it's maybe competing for your attention with other television channels that may be providing other kinds of entertainment, you're going to get that. It's not going to be like boring, responsible Biden. It's going to be a crazy, wild time in which you're not going to be bored by politics. He puts out so much garbage, of course, that it all cancels itself out. Nothing can remain a story or provoke outrage for more than a few minutes because he tops it within a few hours. So I think that's part of the problem we're dealing with in this campaign.
Jacob's exactly right on this. Trump has always been a master of the spectacle. He has always been a master of, if he gets himself in trouble for saying one outrageous thing, he says three other outrageous things. And the natural limited bandwidth of the media, they say, well, let's stop talking about the fact that Trump just said he wanted to eat a live baby and move on to the fact that Trump wants to blow up the Washington Monument. He never fails to give the media and the American people some new spectacle to go, oh my God, what? It is a twisted, dark superpower.
You very aptly referred to him as the drunk uncle. What a funny idea that, well, I can't stand him or his policies, but it's going to be kind of fun. And I wonder if you change the channel. I'm thinking of, I don't know, Ross Perot. He was a drunk uncle, but I mean, no one really took him seriously. If your analysis is right, Jacob, and it does strike me, there's a lot to it. It necessarily speaks to, doesn't it, a debasement of the American electorate, yeah?
Well, at Thanksgiving dinner, do you want to sit next to the drunk uncle or the dull uncle? And I'm not sure. I mean, neither is an ideal choice, but the other guy's going to repeat the same stories,
Right.
dinner at, at like 1:30 instead of 3:00. The drunk uncle may be the more entertaining.
I think Jacob is absolutely right that, this is the essence of his carnival barker appeal in these rallies. But I would point out that it also underscores not only his unfitness for office, but arguably the rapid diminution in his ability to perform even basic functions outside of the theatricality that his followers have come to expect, because these were private meetings. It's one thing to be insane in a rally in Nevada and go off talking about sharks and boats and things like that. But when you are supposed to be meeting in Washington, both to talk about kind of politics and a second term agenda with your most fervent supporters on Capitol Hill. And then he also had a private meeting that same day in Washington on Thursday with the CEOs who are the members of the Business Roundtable. Very similar reports coming out of that. Andrew Ross Sorkin, who's obviously incredibly plugged in, reported that in that meeting where he's trying to get CEOs who seem to be leaning towards him remarkably, despite everything, because they want lower taxes or whatever. Same thing, the rambling, incoherent, information-free, kind of delusional quality of Trump, which might be part of his appeal to his followers, is an active discouragement to people who are considering him to actually do the job of president. And, so that's where the gap opens up, and where I would say that, just pulling back, the show is not a new show, but in a way, that's how we can mark the phases of Trump's decline. Look at his rallies in 2016 versus 2020 versus 2024, and tell me that he has not, even by his own standards, forget about judging him by everybody else's standards, even by his own standards, this is a man on a fairly sharp downward slope.
Susan, I want to say two things. First off, I think your piece was incredibly valuable because it is a benchmark now. And look, all of us are sort of anthropologists of Donald Trump over the last decade. I can't even say that word. But the 2016 Trump had a certain physicality to him. He still had a kind of quick-wittedness to him. 2020 Trump, that was less apparent. And now it is markedly less apparent. This is a guy who, you are absolutely correct in your reporting on this. He has lost many steps. He's now just telling the same anecdotes over and over again. He's not rolling with the punches. He's not as agile as a performer. And that is what drew people to Trump in the first place, was he was a performer. He understood the value of being the big character on the political stage in a way that Hillary Clinton most certainly did not understand that performative aspect of the job. And Biden, to some degree, gets it a little better, but Trump was gifted at it. Look, it's like watching a pro athlete when an NFL player is in his late 40s, suddenly it's not the same show anymore.
No, that's a really great point, especially with the athlete who every once in a while recaptures something. But with Trump, it's not just the repeating of the stories, but the, twice a week descent into absolute, Dadaist doggerel. What the hell was that? Susan, you wrote about Trump's 78th birthday and said if he wins another term in the White House, he's the oldest president ever, except for the current president. And I'm here to tell you, I attended that trial. He is not a healthy 78-year-old man. His color, his shape, he's really looks not well. But here we have another instance of just what we're talking about. Somehow Biden's the old, addled one, and nobody even thinks about the unhealthy 78-year-old. This is maybe an unanswerable question, or we've been struggling with it for years, but why do Biden's mini gaffes at these outsized attention while Trump's, incoherent explosions are just that's, is it sort of Jacob's point about being entertaining, or he's so adjusted expectations that even in his, English as a second language just doesn't matter?
Person, woman, man, camera, TV. Part of it is that Trump hasn't been in the center of the screen in the last couple of years in the way that he was in 2020. And when he talked about person, woman, man, camera, TV in 2020, I think that his mental acuity and fitness for the job was an issue that undercut him in the 2020 election. I mean, people bleach. And that was 4 years ago, Trump. There are many explanations about the different kind of treatment of Biden and Trump. Obviously, one of it, I think, is just the simple kind of physicality of Biden, which, of course, doesn't actually have any bearing per se on, what's going on in his brain, but he visibly has aged in a way that Trump has not. The way he walks has a certain old man shuffle. In my view, the Biden White House's aggressive efforts to pretend that he wasn't aging was, kind of a strategic error rather than finding, ways to be more upfront and address it in a way. I also think there's the hierarchy of crises problem. With Donald Trump, people have been focused on his criminality, his erratic temperament, his mental health, there's so many things to worry about with Donald Trump. Somehow age is just one of that stew. And for Biden, it has become the issue, in part because there are fewer issues, I think. But I don't know.
One subtlety I think is worth thinking about here is that they have such a radically different idea of what the job of president is. And Biden's version of it requires a much greater degree of mental acuity. Biden's conception is that the president is chief executive officer and he appoints people, keeps track of things, understands how the system works, lobbies Congress. All the things that a president traditionally does. And I think Biden, despite the appearance of physical frailty, continues to do them with a very high degree of effectiveness. Firstly, because he knows how the system works and he knows how to work the system. And secondly, because he's made generally excellent appointments and he gives authority to the people he appoints. And the government runs well. It's well managed. With Trump, the conception of the presidency is utterly different. It's a nonstop performance. It's attacking your enemies. It's being a spectacle on social media. It's provoking a constant state of conflict, but it doesn't really involve the traditional executive functions. He doesn't care. He doesn't pay attention to what's going on at the agencies. He paid minimal attention in his first term. And if we're so unfortunate that he gets a second term, he'll pay even less attention. Now, there may be a punitive aspect that would get him interested a little bit in some elements of that job, particularly the Justice Department and so on. But Biden needs to be mentally more agile than Trump to do his version of the presidency.
Biden is a grown-up, and being a grown-up in the presidency is what we need as a president. But Trump is the fun. He's funny. He's a spectacle. He's engaging. All of that, there's always been this sort of idea that, if Biden has one big slip, if Biden does one big mistake, if Biden has one bad fall, that it's all over. I increasingly think that applies to Trump almost more than Biden, because we're not watching a healthy man in this campaign. We're watching a guy who barely does an event a day. Joe Biden still keeps a presidential schedule. He still keeps a bang, bang, bang all day long, run and gun schedule. And Donald Trump has a golf game or one interview on a friendly news outlet or one rally every 3 or 4 days. And I think if Trump, and again, Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's filet of fish versus Joe Biden, I think Trump could have a physical moment that would change the ball game more likely than the president can.
That was my take, being in court, for why he actually did button up and fly straight in response to Mayor Chun, because just a day in jail, coming out without a hairdresser. I mean, the vision of him might have been irrevocably changing. The analysis I've heard in the last 15 minutes is why it maybe works, but not a peep, or am I getting this wrong, that anyone is miscalculating. That is, look, we know that a lot of voters are given genuine pause by the convictions. We know that not a lot of voters, but the very, very narrow stratum that everyone cares about in the 6 swing states do care about the democracy issues. So my basic question is, are the Republican Party and others, buying in too much by being, all in 100% and not hedging somewhat, given the, where the real battle's going to be in November?
I think so. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with Rick's point, though, about Trump's vulnerability on his, physical decline, as real as it may be. I think these narratives take hold, and stories that confirm pre-existing narratives have a certain power that stories that run counter to those narratives don't. And, the narrative around Trump is not that he's falling apart, despite Susan's reporting and, a lot of the reality, just as the narrative that Biden is frail because he's maybe, lost a step physically, even though we really haven't seen any signs of meaningful signs, I think, of mental decline. At the same time, I think another day in court is bad for Trump because it confirms the narrative that he's a criminal with, charges against him in 4 states. And any day he's got a meeting with his probation officer, or is being sentenced, or is filing an appeal, or there's another hearing in another case, I think that's all cumulative harm for Trump, in sort of in the same way that Biden taking a shaky step on uneven ground is.
I had a piece in the Atlantic on this week that he's now a convict. And, I spent 15 years in this system. It's not going to change for him. And he has material deprivations and impingements on his liberty. So, and he had the probation interview this week. Does his status as a convict? He's a convict. That's how we know he had a gun in Florida. He had to fess up and tell the truth. Does his status as a convict weigh him down at all in the next 5 months as you see it?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to get back to this issue of the conviction. I mean, when you look back, right, one of the things that's truly extraordinary is not Trump the showman. We've seen that for 8 years. This is a significant change in his status, and it doesn't need to shift 20% of the Republican electorate or whatever percentage claimed before the conviction that it would matter. We all know that they've been making excuses for Trump for a long time, and that it's not going to be anything like that number that actually refuses to vote for him because he's a convict. But even a significant, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% of independents and Republicans who say they just can't go through with a felon as president, could make a difference in some of these key states. So I don't rule that out, but I think it's important to be, reality based, and the reality of 2024 is a fairly immovable electorate. It's kind of shocking, frankly, even to the extent we can still be shocked in any way, that the difference in the polls after the conviction was so marginal as to not really be discernible in changing the shape of the race. And I don't discount the cumulative point from Jacob. In fact, I think that is quite likely to place a pretty hard ceiling, if nothing else, on Trump's vote. It's hard to see him attracting new support at this moment in time, given everything that he's, already put to bear on the public. But people's minds are made up one way or the other about Trump. The final thing, though, Harry, to your point is, yeah, I think Donald Trump, whatever his campaign says, is very unhappy about bearing this label, about the prospect of imprisonment, about the very uncomfortable situations he may find himself in as a result of this felony conviction. I think that the loudness of their screaming about the case and the verdict and the judicial system is a reflection of their concern about it, both as a political issue and as it personally may impact Trump.
I mean, Harry, one other thing to note, we just came out of the field with both survey work and focus groups in Michigan and Wisconsin. We're rolling through all of our swing states. Among the group of voters, particularly that we address at Lincoln, the more moderate Republicans, higher education, higher income Republicans, no, it is not the vast red-hatted bulk of the MAGA base. But we're not trying to move 1 million of these voters in Wisconsin. I'm trying to move 50, 60,000 of them. And the convictions actually are having a deeper impact than we expected, and a deeper impact than I think a lot of folks in the mainstream press have expected. And there was a takeaway quote from somebody. It struck me so hard. A woman said, in 2016, there were a lot of us who didn't want to say we were voting for Trump, but we did. In 2020, there are a lot of us who don't want to say we're not voting for Trump, but we're not gonna. I sat back like, wow. And it is a shift in the public's mind, because I think that at the end of the day, I'm not an attorney, but it seemed to me that Trump.
Ding, 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 ding. The first time someone on Talking Fed says, I'm not a lawyer, but. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
They tried to blow up Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, but what I think moved the jury was the receipts, the checks, the paper trail. The voters who paid any attention to this craziness, I think a lot of them said, yeah, this wasn't really the deep state. This was a guy he did this thing, and it fits into what they think about Trump. Sometimes he's the lovable rogue, but sometimes he's just a damn criminal. And I think he shifted into the damn criminal box for more people than we've yet really assessed.
It's a really big point. And I just think, Susan, we just can't lose track of that, and just have to remember all the time, everything is baked in, and we are so much at the margins of the frosting or whatever. So you can't help but be influenced, frightened, whatever, one way or another, by the brunt of media coverage and overall reactions. But we are, for purposes of what we're afraid of, playing on a very, very, very narrow field. Speaking of convictions, so Hunter Biden on Tuesday was convicted after a pretty brief deliberation by a Delaware jury for filling out a federal firearm form saying he wasn't a drug user when they determined that he was. Rick, let me go back to you and the pithy tweet you directed at MAGA Nation. Hunter Biden was found guilty of 3 charges by a jury of American citizens. That's how this works, MAGA. Elaborate, please, or what are you driving at?
The idea of watching the gymnastics of Trump's supporters and followers and sycophants after his conviction, that it must have been the deep state, it must have been a conspiracy, it must have been Joe Biden secretly pulling the strings of Merrick Garland, the DOJ, it must have been a conspiracy, when it was a garden variety case in a lot of ways. And so the fact that the president of the United States went out and said, I'm not touching this, I'm not going to pardon my son, he can appeal, I love him, but the jury did what they did. That's a person who respects the rule of law, who respects the fact that his executive power shouldn't be abused, even for his family members. And I think it's just a really telling point about why this country has divided into these silos is that the folks that are behind Donald Trump cannot conceive a world where the power of the executive would not be abused to save a family member. And the supporters of Joe Biden can't imagine a world where it would be. And I mean, look, I think the president, whether it was politically smart or not, I don't think it matters. I think this whole thing was baked in the cake. And as I also said a couple of tweets later, well, I'm not voting for Hunter Biden for president now. I hope that it's probably really going to hurt his campaign.
Although the basic point is so unassailable, right? Not in a billion years could you imagine Trump having anything close to, that he would act similarly in comparable circumstances. This is me as my prosecutor's focus, but in a sense, it's a garden variety case, but in another sense, it really isn't, because it's the sort of charge DOJ just doesn't bring in those facts. And they weren't going to bring here. It was going to be a diversion agreement until a plea agreement unraveled in court for something that, had nothing to do with Hunter. Do you think he got a raw deal? That was my feeling as a prosecutor, because I know how DOJ normally works. Did that come through to you guys, or did it seem like, nah, fair trial, he's guilty, end of story?
Well, Harry, I do think it's normally abnormal, because once you have a special prosecutor, the normal rules don't apply, because a special prosecutor has one incentive in life, which is to get conviction. And it's sort of,
Antonin Scalia was right.
It's surprising in a way that they were willing to make a plea deal originally, but because the charge wasn't very serious, I think that's the way it should have gone, should have been a plea deal. I would just point again to Biden's exemplary behavior, not just in that he has said, of course, he wouldn't pardon or commute the sentence of Hunter Biden, but that he's also dealt with this as a father and a human being. And you see his pain and you see his sympathy for this really reprobate son. I mean, a lot of presidents have had relatives who tried to take advantage of their position. Hunter Biden is kind of distinguished both by the novelty of it. I don't think anyone else has tried to do it by selling paintings. And they're not an artist for $500,000. But I mean, you got to feel bad about it, but a lot of people relate to that experience of having someone in their family who is really troubled, really difficult. And take Trump out of the equation. I mean, forget about that contrast. Just, say, how has Joe Biden handled this terrible situation? He's handled it, I think, as well as anybody could possibly handle it. And I think that has to, if you're human, if you're paying any attention, that has to accrue to his benefit.
But what about that, Susan? I mean, we were just talking about how old he is, just the personal anguish. You wrote, he can't seem to catch a break. I mean, doesn't the anguish have to kind of affect him day to day? He's a father who, and even on the more so because of what Jacob said, he could easily, at any moment, as Trump would have, he could have shut it down again and again, and now he's saying he won't pardon. I just think that pain walks with him on the campaign trail. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but any thoughts knowing Biden?
Yeah, I mean, that's who Biden is a product of this extraordinary combination of family tragedy and relentless focus on the family, both of them. The context for Hunter Biden and this gun charge and his descent into, a very sordid story around crack cocaine, and it's ripped out of the tabloids, really. I mean, his brother, his only surviving brother, dies tragically, and it's in the unraveling that follows that this occurs, that Hunter Biden, already for years an alcoholic, becomes a crack cocaine addict. He later has written a memoir of this time that was used against him in the courtroom. He takes up with his brother's widow. I mean, it's literally the most unseemly, tragic, human, pathos-filled story that there could possibly be. And here is Joe Biden. He has left public service essentially for the only time in his life. He's lost. He's completely lost. Joe Biden has been a senator since he was a young man in 1972. He's decades in the Senate. He's 2 terms as vice president. He doesn't know what to do with himself, and his family is falling apart. And that's the context in which this occurs for this family. And for Biden, there's nothing more important. They played this phone call in the trial of Biden calling Hunter at one point during this whole crisis. And it breaks your heart. It was very sad. It's a dad saying, no matter what, where are you? I just want you to know I'm always there for you. After the verdict, you see Jill Biden holding hands with Hunter Biden as they walk out of the courtroom. The president helicopters quickly up to Wilmington so he can be photographed on the tarmac embracing his son. And I do think that to the extent that Republicans have tried for years to they correctly saw Hunter Biden as the weak link in this chain, as a way to get at Biden politically. They've tried for years to go after Hunter Biden, but this wasn't the case for them. This was too, I think, personal, too tragic, too just sordid and unpleasant. And the Republicans that I saw, the Trump acolytes like Stephen Miller, they immediately dumped on this case in this verdict and said, well, this is just a distraction. It's a devious op by the Justice Department to distract you from the real Hunter Biden scandal.
Which, by the way, Weiss says he's going to continue to pursue, almost savagely. Yeah, well, what about that? So you had Miller. The Republicans overall have been pretty muted and I think not sure-footed on this. How do you analyze their take and their ambivalence about the Hunter conviction?
I don't think they ever want anybody to look into Don Jr. Joking aside, I think that, remember, Donald Trump is being advised by a group of people who are much smarter than Stephen Miller and the yahoos that have advised him in the past. And Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita are smart enough to know that millions and millions of American families have experienced family members with addiction, and millions of American families have seen this tragedy play out in their own lives, and that Trump's people, not to say nothing of Trump, could easily overshoot on this question. It's hard to make Hunter a sympathetic figure in a lot of ways. He is a guy who has struggled with addiction. His behavior while as an addict is awful, but a lot of Americans have seen that. They've lived that in their lives. They've had that in their families.
It's awful, but what it really is characteristic of an addict.
Yeah, right. If Hunter Biden did all these things and he wasn't a drug addict, then you go, holy hell, he's a bad dude. But for a drug addict, it's kind of at that level of chronic, and
he has come out of it.
He's sober now, and God bless him. I hope he stays that way. Look, I also think that they know no voter is going to change their mind about this race for president based on Hunter Biden.
That's your main point, right? What you said about what was that characteristically pithy tweet? How will this affect Hunter Biden's campaign? Right. We're back in. I'm forgetting Nixon's brother and Carter. But there is a motley tradition here.
Clinton's brother. Yeah.
Right. Clinton's brother. Yeah, exactly.
But I was going to say, Harry, the Republicans also have a little bit of a Second Amendment conflict on this one, because if you take an absolutist view of the Second Amendment should mean what it meant in 1789. You can't deny gun licenses to domestic abusers, the case before the Supreme Court right now. And presumably you can't deny them to drug addicts either, which was not a very live issue at the time of the Constitution. But there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who believe that any restriction on the right to own a firearm is a bad restriction. And as much as they may have crazy views about Hunter Biden, they don't like the precedent that actually for filling out a form and saying that you weren't on drugs on a day when maybe you were, maybe you weren't, there's a precedent that could come from this. It's not great for the extremist view.
Yeah, I am a lawyer, and I'll put on my break just to say quickly that I think there's no world in which the Supreme Court or higher court invalidates a crime of lying on a form. But that third conviction, it probably wouldn't affect the sentence, but that third conviction, you can almost see it, whatever your views of Second Amendment rights. You're just a guy who he got convicted of being a unlawful user in possession of a gun. So presumably that under that crime, you've got a gun around and you start using drugs. Suddenly you've got this double felony. That is somewhat funky, if nothing else. And I think he will press that on appeal, but I don't think it'll change. In general, I'll stay in my prosecutorial soapbox for a moment. I do think this is a case that wouldn't have been brought, but for the point that Jacob makes about special counsels and how, in addition, they are completely free from the whole DOJ supervisory structure that exists to make sure like cases are treated like. Lowell tries to make these points in the courts, and you just can't make them there. The arguments that, I've been singled out or whatever, which so many defendants make, just don't have purchase as a way to get indictments dismissed. He's a great lawyer, but I thought that was ill-conceived. And when it came time for the actual trial, all he could say was, you couldn't make any of those points. You just had to say, well, maybe the second he's filling it out, that wasn't a defense with a lot of jury appeal. Man, he is very far from out of the woods. The tax indictments are coming, and Weiss seems to be wanting to burrow around more in 2014 and Eastern Europe. So we're going to maybe test the proposition that you have, Rick, that like nobody really cares about this as far as the election goes, because, he's going to stay in hot water. It's time now to take a moment for our Sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues and topics that are prominent in the news. Today's Sidebar explains juror misconduct and what happens when a juror violates the instructions of the court. And to explain this topic, we welcome Rachel Feinstein. Rachel Feinstein is a comedian and actress. You may recognize her from her roles in Hulu's Life and Beth, Netflix's Parental Advisory special, and her own 3 Comedy Central specials. She's also appeared in Steven Soderbergh's Red Oaks, Judd Apatow's Crashing, and Last Week Tonight with John Oliver and The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Rachel earned a WGA award for her writing contributions to Inside Amy Schumer. And with that, I give you Rachel Feinstein on jury misconduct.
A jury trial is an elaborate event with dozens of rules and procedures designed at bottom that the jury be impartial and that it render judgment based on the admissible evidence presented as opposed to subjective prejudices or outside influences. The core function of juries gives rise to a series of responsibilities and the potential for different forms of juror misconduct. To ensure the jury remain impartial and focused on the evidence at trial, judges give jurors particular instructions on how to handle themselves both in and out of the courtroom. In general, juror misconduct occurs when jurors fail to follow these instructions. That's like when you call your friend, you're like, how random is it? But I feel like he did it. It can take many forms, but the core concern is departure from the imperative of considering only the information presented to them in court. Like, for example, I was in a courtroom once and I was supposed to be in a jury and I raised my hand and I was like, Your Honor, may I approach the stand? And I've never been hated as much as this man rightfully hated me. He was just like, bitch, what? And I was like, I think I can't be impartial in this case. And he was like, why? And I said, well, my friend is a defense attorney and she said that the police sometimes wildly lie. And he was like, wildly lie? And I was like, yes, sir, wildly lie. That's what she said. That's what Edie said. And I was like, she says that they plant evidence. And then I said, but then I'm also kind of partial to think that the guy did it because he has a neck tattoo. So I'm like, there's no way that this guy didn't commit this DUI. He has a neck tattoo. I was like, of course he. Also, how many mistaken DUI? By the way, at this point, I was out of the courtroom, but I feel like the prosecutor and the defense attorney both enjoyed me. Misconduct can first occur in the jury selection process, which is designed to call out jurors who are biased or otherwise unable to be impartial. If a prospective jury conceals important information that could bear on the suitability for service or decline to answer questions put to them honestly, once seated, jurors are typically admonished not to look at outside information. By the way, can they have any snacks? I never made it on an actual jury, but are you allowed to have small, like hand snacks? Is that a term, hand snacks? Such as news reports about the case, and do not do independent research about the parties or witnesses. Don't go on Reddit, you guys. Information is all too available online, but it may be inaccurate. And in any event, by definition, it is not suitable for juries to consider in determining who should win the case. Like, that means, like, don't go to the comments section. Like, if this guy's a public figure, you should not be, like, in the YouTube comment section. Because I don't learn a lot there. Somebody told me once that my arms were fatter than last week. And anything you learn in the YouTube comment section is not going to help you. Someone was tracking my arm fat. A jury is also barred from undertaking their own research about the case. For example, a juror may not seek out the diagram of an intersection where a crash occurred. In cases where it would be difficult to avoid information about the trial, a judge may order sequestration of the jury. Sequestered juries typically stay at a hotel where the court isn't meeting and court personnel shield them from any information about the case. What I want to know is what hotel? Like a Howard Johnson's, or is it an Aloft? Because that matters. Judges frequently instruct jurors not to discuss the case with anyone. That, in fact, includes each other prior to their formal deliberations. That instruction is very difficult to enforce, and it's likely the juries frequently disobey it. Jurors are expected to report immediately any attempts to influence them or any misconduct by other jurors. That can prompt a judge to conduct a hearing and potentially remove a juror before deliberations. This includes threats, bribes, and other forms of intimidation, which are serious crimes in and of themselves. That means you can't do any bribing of the jurors, you guys. That's like really serious. And that means no, not even like a Barnes & Noble gift card. Okay, I'm pretty sure that my mom gave me a $50 Barnes & Noble gift card after they closed. And my husband gave me a $50 Amazon gift card for my birthday because he's an emotional desert. An interesting category of juror misconduct is juror nullification, that if a juror's refusal to follow the law by voting against a party notwithstanding the strength of the evidence. In New York, where the Trump case was tried, the law is expressed that a juror who believes the prosecution has presented proof beyond a reasonable doubt must vote to convict. Other jurisdictions don't formally forbid it, though it is inconsistent with a juror's promise and duty to base their vote on the law and facts. A juror who'd broken the judge's directions can be dismissed from the juror. Alternatively, they can be fined or even found in contempt of court. They may also be banned or disqualified from jury service for a period of time. If a serious breach of conduct has occurred and the jury can no longer be considered impartial, such as a juror distributing external materials to the rest of the jury, a mistrial may be necessary. For Talking Feds, I'm Rachel Feinstein. Watch my Netflix special. Big guy, big guy, big guy. Netflix, it's streaming right now.
Thank you, Rachel Feinstein. Rachel is currently on tour, and you can find more information or purchase tickets at rachel-feinstein.com. That's capital R, Rachel-capital F, Feinstein.com. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we dig up the dirt on the agave plant to find out the difference between tequila and mezcal. So first things first. Tequila is a type of mezcal, much like bourbon is a type of whiskey. In general, tequilas are mezcals, but not all mezcals are tequilas. Allow me to explain. Tequila can only come from the blue agave plant in specific regions of Mexico, like the region of Jalisco, where the city of Tequila is located. No coincidence there. Mezcal, however, can be made from many varieties of agave, specifically from the heart of the agave, known as the piña. The distillery process for tequila and mezcal is also different. Tequila is produced by steaming the blue agave and then distilling it in copper stills for a toasty, clean taste. On the other hand, mezcal, which appropriately means oven-cooked agave, is cooked in earthen pits with wood and charcoal before being distilled in clay pots. No wonder mezcal, which is typically consumed straight, has more of a smoky, earthy taste. Of course, the best way to get to know the differences between tequila and mezcal is to pick up a bottle of each from your Total Wine and More and pour hundreds of years of tradition right into your glass. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's spirited debate. All right, I wanted to reserve some time for talking about maybe the most abysmal performance on at least of the party, if not Trump, this week, which is the voting out of contempt charges for Merrick Garland over his refusal to turn over the audio recordings of Special Prosecutor Robert Hur's interview with President Biden. Let me start here. Since Trump, issues all the stage directions and calls all the plays, was this a direct reaction to the convictions, this very aggressive, far-fetched contempt motion, or do you see it as separate and it was coming, essentially unconnected, it was coming anyway?
I mean, there's the collapse, essentially, of the effort to impeach Joe Biden, and that's the other context for Hunter Biden. And it is also the other context, I think, for what the Republican House has done as Donald Trump's sort of wing on Capitol Hill. And, that's the reason that they impeached the Homeland Security Secretary, Ali Mayorkas, even though they knew the Senate wasn't going to do anything with that. I think it's part of the context, part of the reason that they're going after Attorney General Merrick Garland. It's to distract from sort of the failure of this big investigative agenda that they had when they took back over the House. The other thing is it connects to the beginning of this conversation today, because really for them at this moment, it's that they're desperately acting as sort of the opposition research team for the Trump campaign. And the reason that they want Hur's audio tape of his interview with Joe Biden and why a transcript will not suffice in their view is because they think there would be damaging audio of Biden that would have been the reason that led to Hur's report in which he declined to prosecute Biden, which goes a little bit against our, special counsel theory of maximally charging. And in fact, it's interesting that he found no basis to charge Biden with the possession of the classified documents that he was found to have had from his time as vice president. And he, in that report where he said, okay, I'm not going to go after him, he also kind of pulled a semi-modified Comey.
Oh, that's a rough verb to have in the American lexicon, isn't it? To pull
Indeed.
a Comey. Okay.
Yeah. But, he said he's a well-meaning old man and that a jury would find him too sympathetic and you couldn't convict him. And so the Republicans are desperately, great, give us the proof of the old man. They have the transcript of the remarks, so they don't need it for evidentiary purposes. Biden then invoked executive privilege, and Garland said, okay, well, he's invoked executive privilege. So that's the ridiculous basis for this contempt finding. And it shows that the House GOP is basically the Trump House.
Many of whom, by the way, have defied contempt. You're the expert here of the dark arts, Rick. There's no doubt that's what they wanted for, right?
100%. They want to get a clip of Joe Biden saying, I don't remember. And look, there has never been a more performative, silly, pointless attempt at impeaching a president in the history of the country. There is nothing about Jim Comer and Jim Jordan in this process that has covered the GOP in glory. They have looked silly. They have looked pointless. They have been clowned by Jamie Raskin and Jared Moskowitz and everyone else in this process because they're bringing a meritless impeachment effort. Now, because of that, they needed anything they could grab, because they're going to keep trying to impeach Joe Biden when Joe Biden is dead. There's no world in which they don't keep trying to impeach Joe Biden for the rest of forever. It's not going to work. It's not going to go anywhere. Even Mitch McConnell has been very quick to ice these things down in the Senate. None of it's going to go anywhere, but it does illustrate how weak their overall position is, because they want this for Fox News. They don't really care about this for an actual impeachment. They want to put it on Fox News.
There's no legitimate oversight purpose here at all, right?
There's an interesting and I think very destructive pattern here, which I would call escalation through false parallelism. So, another way to look at it is conservatives who thought that the media was biased on the liberal side. And because you say the CBS or the New York Times is biased, we'll create Fox News, which is openly and extremely biased. Because of the legitimate impeachment of Donald Trump, we will initiate the absurd efforts to impeach Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas. And, say, well, you've been political, so we're now going to take 10 more steps in the direction of explicitly politicizing things. And on the one hand, it creates uncertainty, and on the other hand, it drives polarization. But I think you have to get back to what they're basing it on. And what they're basing it on is an idea of tit for tat, but it's not really tit for tat. It's an extreme overreaction to a series of grievances that they've been accumulating.
Now, let me add, Mayorkas, I think, is really obscure to most Americans. It came and went, and what even happened. Garland, no. Garland's pretty prominent. People have thoughts about him. Has he weathered the broadsides against him so far? Does it actually stick to him, do you think? Or it's just a big nothing? It cannot go anywhere. I'm just wondering if somehow it tars Garland in the public eye where he has a slightly higher profile than Ali Mayorkas.
I just don't see it. I just don't see it moving any numbers. It's so deeply under the radar screen for 99% of American voters. Anybody who would be influenced by it is already a Trump voter.
The critique of Merrick Garland, from many Democrats is the opposite. And I think that will be interesting to see how history judges that, because there is certainly an argument. We don't have the full information about what went on inside the Justice Department, but there is a tragic situation here where Americans are going to go to the polls this November without having the benefit of understanding whether Donald Trump is going to be held accountable and found guilty of inciting essentially a coup against the U.S. government in 2020. These are extraordinarily significant charges brought by the U.S. Justice Department, brought by a federal special counsel, Jack Smith, appointed by Garland, but only quite belatedly. And it seems to me, again and again, if you just pull out of the day-to-day, which is hard to do because there's so much happening day-to-day, but if you just pull out of it, what's the big macro story of 2024? It's that Donald Trump was indicted 4 times, and none of these trials, except for the most insignificant in terms of our public functioning of our democracy, are going to happen before the election. And arguably, that is as much Merrick Garland's fault as it is anyone else's. And I just think it's a terrible tragedy that we're 4 years after the events of 2020, and we are where we are.
Just a quick closeout question here. It really is going nowhere. They know it's going nowhere. Is there an end game here? Is it just we use it as this whipping post now for Garland and that's the end of it? What, do they have anything in mind?
To quote the old Joe Haldeman book, this is the forever war. They will never stop. They have to always feed the content machine on the MAGA right. They have to feed Fox, Newsmax, OAN, and all these social media folks. They always have to give them something new to poke the amygdala of the Republican voter base. It will never stop. It's a conveyor belt that will never stop turning for them.
Thus say we all. Sounds like. Hey, we just have a minute left for our final feature of Talking 5, where we take a question from a listener, and each of us has to answer it in 5 words or fewer. Today's question comes from the Republican candidate for the President of the United States. It's a little hard to follow, but here's how it reads. What would happen if the boat sank from its weight and you were in the boat and you have this tremendously powerful battery and the battery's now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there? And I guess here's the question. Do I stay on top of the boat and get electrocuted, or do I jump over by the shark and not get electrocuted? 5 words or fewer, please, panelists.
Well, if your boat's overweight, you throw Trump off.
There you go. So, all right.
I'll take the electrocution, please.
Electric boat, not gonna electrocute.
That's a good point. I think we're all on the same general thrust. I'm saying, if you're driving, we jump. We are out of time. Thank you so much to Susan, Jacob, and Rick. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. You can leave voicemails with your questions for me and our guests, whether for Talking 5 or general questions about the inner workings of the legal system for our Sidebar segments. All you have to do is call 727-279-5339 and leave a voice message. You can also email us your questions at questions@talkingfeds.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McGardle. Our research producer is Zeke Reed. Rosie Dawn Griffin and David Lieberman are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Anna Salvatore. Thanks very much to Rachel Feinstein for explaining jury misconduct. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.